All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining this instance of the Antrea community meeting. Today is April the 11th, and for today we have a fairly packed agenda. So we will start with a discussion of CI improvements led by Xuyang. And in the second part of the meeting, instead, we will review some Antrea APIs which are still in alpha status to figure out which ones can be promoted to beta or even be promoted to GA. So this is the agenda for today. At the end, hopefully we'll have some time for open discussion. But in the meanwhile, maybe let's start with the CI conversation with Xuang. So that's all from me. So I'll hand it over to Xuang for some updates.
Thanks, Eduardo. And let me share my screen first. Hello, everyone. I'm Shu Yang, and today I will introduce some new features and enhancements for the Antrea Jenkins CI pipeline. For the agenda, first I will introduce some new CI features and the related trigger phrases that developers can use in their PR. And also I will talk about the recent enhancements that improves the stability of the CI pipeline. And finally, we will talk about some future improvements like the new features or enhancements we want to bring in next release or in a long term. So firstly, I want to introduce some new features for the Jenkins CI pipeline, and I will talk about new features for Windows testbed first, and then Andrew will introduce the implementation of the canned CI support. Also, we have supported the Rancher CI since Antrea 1.11, which is also a new feature for the Jenkins pipeline. And okay, let's start from the new features in Windows CI. So we know the Windows has a very different testbed compared to Linux node. And also building Antrea Windows image takes much more time than building Linux image. So we want to optimize it to accelerate the whole process, not only for canned pipeline, but also for other Windows developers who want to quickly build a Windows image for verification or development. So that's our motivation. And one of the optimization is to enable building the Windows base image to accelerate building agent image, because after investigation, we found actually we waste a lot of time on downloading duplicate libraries and files to create the base environment. So just like what we did in Linux, we started to support building Windows base image after Antrea 1.8. And on our testbed, building latest Antrea Windows image can cost more than six minutes without base image. But building Windows image with base image support will only take about 2 minutes. So these new features can reduce image building time by more than 60%. And another good thing is we have updated the makefile, so the developer don't need to change their building comments. Once you update Antrea to 1.8 or later version, this feature is enabled by default. And the next feature is also for Windows testbed, is that we supported Antrea Windows testbed with Containerd runtime after 1.10. As we know, after Kubernetes 1.24, the Docker became a deprecated feature, so we need a Containerd support to verify Antrea agent supports. The most different points for the containerd testbed is that it has one more image node for image building, because we don't want to install and manage both containerd and Docker on the same Windows host, and it could bring potential conflicts during tests. So we only run containerd on Windows worker nodes, and only run Docker for building image on another Windows image node. So other workflows for containerd CI pipeline is as same as the Docker testbed. And you can see at the lower left, we have 3 new trigger phrases for E2E, conformance, and network policy on Windows testbed. Now, after Antrea 1.10, developers can trigger Windows containerd test by these 3 trigger comments. And another thing I want to highlight is that the test Windows all command will trigger all Windows CI jobs, including Docker and containerd test jobs after Antrea 1.10. And another new feature is that we support running Jenkins can test. Since Andrew is the contributor of this feature, and I will invite Andrew to talk about more details about design and implementation. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Song. So, kind CI on Jenkins. Actually, there are few tools that claim to partially replace a fully fledged Kubernetes cluster. And using them, a developer can have their own local clusters instance. So, using that cluster, a developer can run or deploy their application or execute the test. So the kind is one of them. As we know that like kind or Kubernetes in Docker is a suite of tooling for the local Kubernetes cluster, where each node is a Docker container, and kind targets local cluster for the testing purpose. So we have added a set of kind testbed as a Jenkins node, and kind testbed is a more lightweight than the 3 Kubernetes cluster. And the related to like conformance test here, we are running kind test in Jenkins VM instead of GitHub Actions. Why? Because conformance test requires some considerable amount of memory. That's why we prefer Jenkins VM instead of GitHub Actions. So the next one related to the cluster API. Actually, the cluster API is a framework to create Kubernetes cluster with a different cloud provider, such as AWS, vSphere, Azure. And for the our vSphere environment, the regular jobs like E2E, conformance, and network policy, these are using this framework to create one-time VMs for the new Kubernetes cluster. So like although kind test can save lots of resources for us, and it simulates multiple nodes on one real host, but we can say that like cluster created by KV is still closer to the real scenario, and we will keep using it for the other our regular Jenkins job. And for the kind, currently we have 2 trigger phases, one for the conformance test and other for the network policy test. So when we trigger these phases on GitHub PR, then it will start running the test in Jenkins. So we can see in the workflow, first you will trigger the Jenkins test, then it will create a new kind cluster, and then it will start running conformance or network policy test. And after finishing the test, it will delete the created cluster. But suppose you have triggered the phase, and then it will create the new kind cluster, and it will start the test. And during that time, if you abort the process, then that case kind cluster will not be deleted, and it becomes garbage cluster. So we need to handle this aborted case also. And for handling this, I have created a PR. So in that PR, I have added 135-minute timeout for the test. So after merging that PR, what will be the updated flow? Like if you trigger the phase, then it will start creating a new kind cluster. And just before running the actual test, it will run the cleanup function. And there we will check if there is any cluster present from more than 135 minutes, then we need to delete that particular cluster. And after finishing the cleanup function, it will start the actual test on new kind cluster. Then after finishing the test, it will delete the cluster. So these all about the workflow. And one more thing, like currently we have added 6 kind test bed with one slot for handling the parallel runs. But in future, we will handle that in a single test bed. We will create multiple cluster in the single test bed. We will run the multiple tests in the single test bed, and that work is in progress. So that's all from my side. Now, Shwang, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And the next new feature is about the rancher CI pipeline. But we won't cover more details in today's presentation because Pocket had introduced its implementation in last month's community meeting. I just want to reaffirm if you want to test Antrea as a CNI plugin on Rancher testbed, it can be supported after Antrea 1.11. Okay, I just finished the new features introduction. And next, I will talk about some enhancements which improve the stability for our CI pipeline. And the first one I want to talk about is the private SME support. The SME can be divided into channel server and SME client, which can help us expose the private Jenkins service to the public websites like GitHub safely. Previously, we used the public service to create our channel for GitHub requests. But recently, the public service faced a serious service abusing issue, and their maintainer have to shut down the service for more than 2 weeks. And so I think for Antrea CI pipeline, we can't just rely on the public service. So we need another backup service for the SMEE. So we also have this opportunity to improve the stability because we can redeploy the SMEE server and the clients based on the latest environment. And now we have enabled private SME service for Antrea CI since last month. And also we have good news is this week, the public SME service also back to normal. So in the future, we are able to migrate SME between public and the private service to improve the stability and the robustness for our private Jenkins pipeline. And another enhancement is that we support multiple Jenkins description fields. Previously, we only create the public Jenkins job YAML for users who want to build their own Jenkins testbed. But for other testbeds, we didn't support their description fields. But now we created another lab Jenkins YAML file for the private Jenkins job. So developers can learn how these CI test jobs run. And in the future, we also hope we can involve more developers in the CI pipeline contribution. And next, I will introduce some future improvements. I have said we are using VMC for the public Jenkins, but currently we are working on migrate it to the AWS. And in the future, we will have more CI jobs running with CAN or CPV support, as Andrew said. For the CAN CI tests, and Jiajing is working on support multi-cluster CI in CAN. And Andrew will continue working on migrate our IPv6 and other more Jenkins jobs to canned. And moreover, our Windows CI jobs still takes more time than the Linux jobs. So we will continue working on optimization and involve more Windows improvements in the next release. So here are some reference for the presentation. And if you have more questions, feel free to ask me or Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. So do we have any question, comment, any curiosity?
I have a quick question. Are we planning to keep the Jenkins Windows CI jobs on Docker, or are we planning to remove them and just keep the containerd ones?
Currently, we keep both Docker and containerd testbed for Windows, but in the future, maybe we will deprecate the Docker testbed because we see the Kubernetes community they deprecate the Docker after 1.24. So I think yes, in the future we will only use the containerd testbed, but currently I think we still support both of them.
Okay, thank you.
All right. It was very informative. And do we have any other question on this topic? Okay, seems that we don't have any additional question. And my only curiosity was about what you mentioned about the multi-cluster CI on kind that Jajin is working on. And running it on kind, in terms of in terms of resources that we will need, do we need to allocate, for instance, still multiple VMs to run a multi-cluster, or are we going to deploy, simulate multiple clusters on a single VM, or maybe that's not yet been defined?
I think the purpose to run multi-cluster job in kind is only deployed is in a single VM. But as you said, this VM need more resources for the multi-cluster test.
Okay, so we'll probably use a larger VM format for running these tests. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right, so that was my only curiosity. It seems that we don't have any other question on the CI, so perhaps we can move to the next topic, and which is about to discuss. Thank you, Xiang. Which is about discussing the APIs that we can or want to promote. So I don't know who's going to lead this conversation. Antonin, Chan, who is going to do that?
Anthony, do you want to start since you began the conversation? Or I could, I also summarized something in a GitHub issue with items of Antrea 2.0.
Please go ahead, Chan, since you opened the issue today.
Okay. Yes, I suppose my screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. This is an issue about the preparation we might need to do for Antrea 2.0, and I just summarized something we have discussed before in other channels, and I have added something I have investigated for this release, and it's mainly about the API migration and API removal, and also there are some items. There are some tasks to promote some feature gates that are not. Some of them are not API based, but just code based. We may want to promote some of them to next stage, and the remainings are about configuration options. We added some configurations in Antrea 1 and Antrea 1.0 to 1.11, but and we deprecated some configurations, but never really remove them from the configuration file. So I think it's also a good opportunity to remove the deprecated configurations in the new major release. Perhaps we could take a look at them one by one. First, maybe we could focus on the API. Yeah, I know Anthony proposed to introduce new version for some APIs that have been introduced for a long time and have been used widely. Anthony, do you want to start this part?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we've noticed is that, well, we knew that, but most of the Antrea APIs are still in a V1 alpha stage. For some of them, we've introduced new versions. For example, in the for the network policy, things like cluster groups, where we may have had like more than one version, but most of them are in alpha 1 or alpha 2 stage, and we think that Antrea is a pretty mature project now. We've been around for close to 5 years, and so it doesn't necessarily send the right signal to the community to keep most of our APIs in V1 alpha stage, when in truth we're kind of like telling users of Antrea that some of those APIs at least are production ready and can be used in their production Kubernetes clusters. And so we should consider, if not moving them straight to V1, at least moving them to beta maturity, so that we can like send a better message to our users and our community. And I was internally kind of like, I generated some basic proposal about which versions we could adopt, and channeled some feedback. And I see that here in his issue, Chan has kind of like a proposal for all the different APIs that we have. And as we move to a new version of those APIs, we'll stick to our policy about backward compatibility and upgrade paths for users. And yeah, that's about it. I know that Chan had some comments about potential improvements to some API, because as we change the version of those APIs, this is kind of like a good opportunity to make modifications to the API and API types that may break backwards compatibility. Of course, that means that for a while, we need to be able to support both versions of the APIs in accordance to our upgrade policies. But this is a good opportunity to do some cleanups to some of the APIs. Trace flow, for example, I know that over the last couple of years, we've like taken note of some possible improvements that Chan has detailed here. And if there is an API that you've been working on, and you kind of like have something on the back burners that you think should be improved, I think now is the right time to speak up, because obviously upgrading APIs, changing the versions, that's a bit painful. And so we don't want to be doing this all the time. It's painful for us and painful for users. So if you have like improvements that you want to suggest for the APIs, now is the right time to do it. And you can leave a comment on Chan's issue.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Yeah. I have already identified some defects in the current APIs while I was doing some investigation. For example, two major issues I found in trace flow and Antrea agent and the controller info is for trace flow, there are two fields introduced in the first version, but they're never used, and it seems redundant with the field with the same name in its parent struct. I was not sure it was kept for future usage, or is added by mistake. I think we should do a cleanup if it's not by design. When we graduate this, when we introduce a new version of TraceFlow API, and except for that, I'm not sure if we are confident to graduate the TraceFlow to beta or to V1 directly, if we are confident enough. I remember Jianjun said he maybe not very confident of about graduating to V1 directly. Yeah, so I left this as an open question about this API, and for the other one, Antrea agent info and Antrea controller info, I found that since this is the first CRD we introduced, I think we might made some mistakes when adding this CRD, because the schema is unstructured, and it's still that case till now. So I think we should maybe this is not really related to graduating to next release, but we should do it immediately if it was a mistake, because typically any kind of data can be stored in the CR. Yeah. And except for that, I don't have other concerns on this on the new version of Antrea agent info and Antrea control info, because they are basically for view purpose only, and I don't see a big risk to have a V1 version for that. And for other APIs, I think we discussed in other channels, and personally, I'm fine with the proposal Anthony had. I'm sure if others have comments on this part. And besides that, I also added two other APIs or two other group of APIs for consideration. The first one is the multicast group. I think this feature it may depends on whether we could make a multicast feature beta before 2.0, and as far as I know, the multicast group API implementation should be straightforward, and there should be no big risk to say this feature is beta. Yeah. And for the group of stats API, my concern was currently we don't persistent persist the stats in any storage, and every time the controller restarts, the stats of neural policies will be reset, and will starting from 0. So until we introduced some persistent storage or use CRD to persist this data, I'm not confident to graduating it to next stage. So any comments on this proposal, or you want to add a new API you are familiar with, is welcome.
No comment from me. I believe that all these APIs are ready for a promotion. So yeah, nothing to object here. Any other comment or question from the team?
Chen, Tony, I have a question regarding the promotion. I saw that you input them on the entry 2.0. Does it mean that we only promote them in this version, or we will also do that in version 1?
I think it's not necessary to make all promotion in 2.0. Yeah, I think it's fine to do it before that release. I thought we just want to make sure that we have reasonable beta and GA features in the next major release. Yeah. But the process could be could be in this, still in this in the major release of 1.0. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Besides, I may talk about this part in the next section about the API deprecation and the removal policy.
Yeah, I agree with Chen, and I personally have a preference for option 1 that Chen describes in the issue, which is like introduce the new API versions in 1.x and then remove deprecated APIs in 2.0, which is the real breaking change.
Yeah. Okay, if there's no comments about this part, perhaps we could talk about the API deprecation and removal.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
I investigated the Kubernetes way to deprecate a stale version and eventually remove it. However, I think the standard way, at least the documented way, is not very simple to users, especially for users that are not that familiar with Kubernetes API. Yeah. So, basically, it provides 2 options. Maybe this part. Sorry. Yeah. Maybe let me talk about why we need to worry about this. Because when we add a new version of an API, we may choose to change the storage version of this API. For example, when we have V1 beta 1 and we add a V1 at a new version, and then eventually we want users to migrate to the new version, but the users may have used the previous version for a while, and they have persistent data in etcd, which is written in the version of the previous one. But even we updated the CRD configuration to say that the storage version should now be V1. The existing data doesn't automatically update to the new version, and they will be kept as they are until there is a chance to rewrite the object to etcd. So there could be two cases, actually three cases. The first is the user create new object, then the object will be written to etcd in the new version automatically, and we don't need to worry about that. The second case is user before upgrade, they have some data in etcd, and now they made some change to the existing data. The object will be rewritten to the etcd and updated to the new version, regardless of which version it was. And we don't need to worry about this case either. The last case is that user has some persistent data in etcd before upgrade, and after we change the storage version, they never touch the existing data. They may read them, but as long as there is no update request to that object, it will be kept as is forever. So regardless how many minor release we support for multiple versions, eventually we want to remove the stale one. But as long as the data is not modified, it will still be the old version. And one day, if we want to remove the support of the old version, we updated the CRD to remove the version, and the user will not be able to apply that CRD because there are two problems. The first is the API will block the CRD update API will block the request because the status stored versions field will have two versions until user remove the old one manually. And this is by cumulative design. And another problem is even user is able to do this themselves, as long as there is at least one stale object is stored in etcd, even the update request is not, the CRD update request is not blocked and is applied successfully. The CR, that API will no longer be available because the API server will not be able to convert the stored object to the right version because the missing version in CRD schema, and the API will stop working. So to make sure that user could continue using that API in the future, there are two preconditions. The first one is all of the stored objects need to be stored, updated to a new version. And the status field stored version should be updated to contain to not contain the remote version, so that the update of CRD could success. So Kubernetes could documented 2 ways to do that. The first option is to use a storage version migrator. I tried this repo. I'm not sure whether it's mutual enough, but at least it's not very friendly to end user, because you will have to download this repo and run some make command to get the manifest of the jobs, and that's I think it also includes some CRDs to record the progress of cleanup of the migration. And it's not documented that you also need to make the image, the pod image for the cleanup. Finally, you will need to apply the manifest and make sure the image is available in your cluster, and then wait the job finishes. So I think it's not very friendly to end users, yeah, especially who is not familiar with this stuff. And after that, you'd have to remove the old version from the stated field manually. The second option is it sounds simpler, but it's pure manual operations, because the key of upgrade existing objects is to make sure that every object is updated once. So the solution is ask users to list all existing objects and write them back with the same content, so that the API server could automatically store the objects in the latest version. But the user will still need to remove the field in stated field, the old version in the stated field. And if you remember how we deal with the API group migration, we introduced a mirroring controller, and it runs. It is a long-running controller in Antrea controller, and will be responsible for mirroring the objects user stored in old API group to new group. But I think that scenario is much more complex than the current one, because in that one they are not same. They are not same API. So we will have we are actually copying the data and convert them, and we are actually dealing we were actually dealing with 2 objects, because the same object exists in 2 groups at the same time. But currently, our purpose is only making sure that every object is updated once with exactly same content. So the current requirement is much simpler. So I'm not sure whether to introduce a controller back in Antrea controller is really necessary. And since this is an opportunity of introduce a new major release, I think perhaps it's not bad to ask users to do some one click to perform some one step command to migrate from old major release. So I introduced some I investigated some some other projects and found that they did the similar things by adding a command in their CLI, and that command just performs what the documentation describes. Yeah, listing the objects, existing objects, and writing them back during the execution. And I think that code is very straightforward and not hard to write. And and the benefit of that approach is that it has no impact on the existing long-running process like Antrea controller. If we add a new controller to do this API migration, there are some changes needed to. There are some side effects. First, we need to grant unnecessary permissions because Antrea controller now will need to create or update all CRD resources, which we don't have to before. And the second is that it will have to cache all objects, even it was not used by Antrea controller itself. So it will increase the memory and the CPU usage to have a controller in that in that component. But and it's also more hard to control because we will have to run it until we are confident that user have migrated all resources to new version, and we might only remove that controller quite some minor release later. But with a new command, one-step command, the disadvantages I describe for a controller is not there, and I see that more and more projects are using their CLI to do the installation for their software, and also some upgrades and managing functionalities are implemented in their CLI. So I think it's not new to users that they could use Antrea's CLI to gracefully upgrade to a new Antrea major release. Yeah, and the only disadvantage is that it requires user to operate the CLI once when they are in this case. But for users that who deploy a new cluster 2.0, I think that's not a problem. Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to bring this up earlier, especially before we start the 2.0 release, is that I think Antrea 2.0 could have two meanings to APIs. The first one, as Anthony just mentioned, is that it means the end of support for older versions, and it could also mean that it's the start of the support of new versions. I think different projects have different policies. I saw some projects like Istio, when they introduced the 1.0, they just add new they just copy their old APIs and create new APIs, and they have to I'm not sure how many minor release later, they just remove the support of the older versions. Yeah, but in our case, I think since we are preparing the new major release, we could consider that do some preparation. For example, if we know what we want to graduate in the next major release, we could add the new versions earlier before that. For example, at least 2 minor release earlier than that in the next minor release of 1.0, so that users get enough time window to migrate to new versions, and then we could just remove the deprecated API versions in the next major release, as the major release normally also means some non-compatible changes. So it's reasonable to remove some deprecated API versions, but we are not really non-backwards compatible, because we also provide some tools, or we do it automatically to help user grade for upgrade to new major release. And if we follow the easier way, or we could just add new versions in 1.0 which means that this is the start of support of new versions, and then we support the 2 versions for some minor release, and eventually remove the deprecated APIs, for example 2.2. But regardless of which way we choose, I think we need to consider how to do the cleanup earlier, and whether it is necessary to introduce tools or controllers to help user grade for upgrade. Basically, I summarized the 3 options. The first one is we just leave the upgrade to users that and guide them to follow Kubernetes options. But I feel this is not right friendly, and I think at least some projects tries to avoid that. For example, the Cert Manager project, they had a tool. They introduced a tool like I will describe in the third option. And the second choice is that we, like a mirroring controller, we add a new controller to help user migrate the stored object. But I have, the disadvantages I have described are there. And the third one is that we do it like a Cert Manager and introduce sub command in Antrea, and we document the upgrade path and highlight it in the release note of 2.0, and to make sure that user should execute the command once if they are migrating from older version and they do have persistent data. Any comments about?
No, not much from me. I just want to say that the third option the one that's apparently seems your preferred for the users that are leveraging the Antrea operator. I think that we can also use the operator to automate this execution of resource upgrades. That would be also consistent to the third option. We can probably just have, the operator calling the same logic implemented by the CLI.
You mean the Antrea operator could execute some job when deploying a new one? Okay. Yeah, that may be a choice. Yeah, but I think not many.
No, I don't know how many are using the operator either. I have no idea. I'm just saying that we can go with the third approach, and then we can have the operator use the same logic, so that at least for the users that are leveraging it, the migration will be transparent.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, is there any comments about these options? And yeah, personally, my preference is the third one. We could, maybe it's too early to get a real feedback on this proposal. Yeah, feel free to leave comments or direct message me if you have a comment.
Thanks, Chan. I think that would be great to keep all the discussion on the PR. I appreciate maybe everyone needs to think a little bit about this, but yeah. And if you don't have any feedback now, as Chan said, just let's keep the conversation on the PR.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Cool. So, any final question, comment regarding the migration strategy? All right, so we are pretty much at time for today's meeting, but if there is any other topic that you would like to discuss, any other thing that you'd like to mention, please go ahead. We have 1 minute for open discussion. Of course, if needed, we can stretch the meeting for a few more minutes. So I'll wait, let's say, if you say 10 to 20 seconds for anyone to propose a topic. Otherwise, we'll probably finish it here. All right, it seems that there is nothing else for today, so I would like to thank everyone for attending, and especially thanks a lot to Xiang, Anju, and Chan for presenting today's topic, and we'll meet again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.